Before we start, let me say this. What you are about to hear is not speculation. Every detail in this case has been verified, cross-referenced, and documented. The timeline I am about to walk you through was reconstructed from security footage, witness statements, cell tower data, and one very small object that should not have been where it was found. My name does not matter. What matters is that I spent 8 months inside this case, and by the end, I understood why the initial investigators walked away. Not because the evidence was thin, because following it meant accepting something uncomfortable about the people involved. This is the case of Marcus Holloway, a night shift security guard who disappeared from Ridgeway Industrial Complex on a Tuesday morning in early spring. He was 41 years old. He had worked the overnight shift alone for 6 years. He was dependable, quiet, the kind of person you would describe as invisible until he was gone. The complex itself sits just outside a mid-sized town, surrounded by empty fields and a 2-lane highway that sees maybe a dozen cars after midnight. 4 warehouses, 1 administrative building, a perimeter fence with a single entrance gate. Marcus was the only person on site between 11 at night and 7 in the morning. On the night he vanished, everything seemed routine. He clocked in at 10:52 p.m. He made his first round at midnight. He returned to the security office and sat down in front of the monitors. The cameras captured all of this, 16 cameras, covering every exterior door, every corridor, every loading bay. At 2047 a.m., Marcus stood up from his desk. He picked up his flashlight. He walked out of the office and turned left down the main corridor toward Warehouse C. The camera at the corridor entrance shows him clearly. He is calm. His pace is normal. He is not running. He is not looking over his shoulder. He walks out of frame. He never walks back. At 7:03 a.m., the day shift supervisor arrived and found the security office empty. The chair was pushed back. The monitors were still running. Marcus's jacket was draped over the back of the chair. His phone was on the desk, screen dark. His keys were in the ignition of his car, still parked in the employee lot. The supervisor called his cell. It rang from the desk. He walked the complex. He checked every warehouse, every corridor, every bathroom. He found nothing. At 7:42 a.m., he called the police. The initial response was standard missing person protocol. Officers searched the complex. They reviewed the footage. They confirmed what the supervisor had already reported. Marcus Holloway walked into the corridor at 2047 a.m. and did not come back. But here is the problem. Warehouse C has only 2 exits. The main corridor entrance, where Marcus entered, and an emergency exit at the far end that triggers an alarm if opened. The alarm never triggered. The camera at the corridor entrance never shows Marcus leaving. The emergency exit camera shows nothing. So where did he go? The lead detective at the time was a man named Warren Grissom. He had been with the department for 19 years. He was methodical. He did not like loose ends. He pulled every frame of footage from that night. He mapped Marcus's route. He measured the corridor. He walked it himself, timing every step. The corridor is 200 feet long. It takes roughly 45 seconds to walk end to end at a normal pace. Marcus entered at 2,047,012 a.m. If he had walked to the far end and turned back immediately, he should have reappeared by 2,048,045 a.m. at the latest. He did not. Grissom expanded the search. He reviewed footage from all 16 cameras for the entire night. He found nothing. No one else entered the complex. No vehicles approached the perimeter. The gate logs showed no activity. He interviewed the day shift supervisor. He interviewed Marcus's co-workers from previous shifts. He interviewed the site manager, the maintenance crew, the janitorial staff. Everyone said the same thing. Marcus was reliable. He kept to himself. He did not have problems with anyone. Grissom requested Marcus's phone records. The last outgoing call was at 9:14 p.m. the night before to a pizza delivery service. The last text message was at 10:03 p.m. to his ex-wife, confirming he would pick up their daughter the following weekend. Nothing unusual. He checked Marcus's bank account. No large withdrawals, no suspicious transactions. His car was still in the lot. His apartment showed no signs of hurry or distress. His mail was stacked neatly on the counter. His bed was made. 3 days into the investigation, a maintenance worker named Joel Pryor was asked to inspect Warehouse C, specifically the corridor where Marcus was last seen. He was told to check for structural issues, hidden access points, anything that might explain how someone could vanish. He found nothing structural, but he did find something. On the floor, 20 feet from the corridor entrance, there was a small object partially wedged beneath a metal shelving unit. It was a digital timer, the kind you might use in a kitchen or a workshop. It had a small LED screen and 2 buttons. When Joel picked it up, the screen was still lit. It was counting down. When he brought it to Grissom, the timer read 4 hours, 18 minutes, and 33 seconds. Grissom photographed it. He documented the exact position where it was found. He ran the serial number. The timer was a common model, sold online and in hardware stores. Untraceable. But here is what made Grissom stop. The timer had been set to count down from 72 hours. That meant it had been placed in the corridor roughly 67 hours earlier. That placed it within a narrow window, just hours before Marcus disappeared. Who set the timer? Why? And what was it counting down to? Grissom sent the timer to the forensics lab. They found no fingerprints. The casing had been wiped clean. The internal components were standard. No modifications. No hidden mechanisms. It was just a timer. But it had been placed deliberately, and Marcus had walked toward it. This is where the case splits. The initial theory was that Marcus staged his own disappearance, that he walked into the corridor, disabled or avoided the cameras somehow, and left the complex through an exit no one had accounted for. The timer was a distraction, a planted clue to confuse the timeline. But Grissom did not believe that. He could not explain how Marcus left. He could not explain the timer, and he could not explain why a man with no debts, no legal trouble, and no apparent motive would vanish in the middle of a shift, leaving behind his phone, his keys, and his jacket. The second theory was foul play, that someone else was in the complex that night, that Marcus encountered them in the corridor, that he was taken, and the timer was left as a signature or a message. But that theory had problems too. The cameras showed no one else. The gate logs were clean. perimeter was secure. If someone had been inside, how did they get in? How did they get out? And how did they remove Marcus without being seen? Grissom spent 2 more weeks on the case. He re-interviewed everyone. He walked the complex at night, alone, trying to see what Marcus might have seen. He reviewed personnel files, looking for anyone with access who might have had a reason to harm Marcus or help him disappear. He found one name that kept appearing in the margins. A man named Owen Talley. Owen worked in logistics for the company that leased Warehouse C. He had been on site 3 days before Marcus disappeared, overseeing a shipment transfer. He had access to the complex. He had a key card that worked on all interior doors. Grissom brought Owen in for a voluntary interview. Owen was calm, cooperative. He confirmed he had been at the complex the previous week. He said he had not seen Marcus that night. He said he left the site at 16:30 p.m. and went home. He provided his time card. His supervisor confirmed it. But when Grissom asked Owen if he recognized the timer, something shifted. Owen looked at the photograph for a long time. Then, he said no. He had never seen it before. Grissom did not believe him. He ran a deeper background check. Owen Talley had no criminal record. He had worked for the logistics company for 8 years. He was married. He had 2 children. He lived 40 minutes away from the complex, in a subdivision with sidewalks and streetlights. But 6 years earlier, Owen had been questioned in connection with a workplace theft investigation at another facility. The case was dropped due to lack of evidence. The details were thin, but the report mentioned that Owen had been seen on security footage in an area he should not have been, at a time that did not match his shift. Grissom noted the pattern. Access, timing, cameras that did not tell the full story. He requested Owen's cell tower data for the night Marcus disappeared. The data showed Owen's phone pinging off a tower 12 miles south of the complex at 2051 a.m., 4 minutes after Marcus walked into the corridor. Owen's home was 38 miles north. When Grissom called Owen back in, Owen brought a lawyer. The second interview lasted 11 minutes. Owen stated that he had been driving that night. He could not sleep. He went for a drive. He did not go near the complex. Grissom asked why his phone pinged near the complex if he was driving south. Owen said he must have taken a different route than he remembered. Grissom asked if Owen owned a digital timer. Owen said he did not recall. The interview ended. 2 days later, Grissom received a call from the site manager at Ridgeway. A second maintenance worker had found something in Warehouse C, not in the corridor, but in a storage room adjacent to it. The room was used for equipment that was rarely accessed. Cleaning supplies, spare parts, old furniture. Inside, behind a stack of folding chairs, there was a canvas tarp. When the worker moved the tarp, he found a small duffel bag. Inside the bag were Marcus Holloway's security badge, his flashlight, and a pair of work gloves that did not belong to him. The gloves were sent to forensics. They came back with trace DNA, not Marcus's. Owen Talley's Dr. Grissom moved carefully after that. He knew the gloves alone were not enough. A defense attorney could argue contamination, cross-contact, secondary transfer. Owen worked on site. He had access. The presence of his DNA in a storage room did not prove he had been there the night Marcus disappeared. But it was a thread, and Grissom believed in pulling threads. He went back through the security footage, not just the night Marcus vanished, but the 3 days prior. He watched every frame where Owen Telly appeared. He noted timestamps. He mapped Owen's movements through the complex during the shipment transfer. On the second day of review, Grissom found something. At 4:17 p.m., 3 days before Marcus disappeared, Owen was seen on camera entering Warehouse C through the main corridor entrance. He was carrying a clipboard. He walked past the camera, heading deeper into the warehouse. Normal. Routine. But Owen did not reappear on that camera for 41 minutes. The shipment transfer he was overseeing should have taken 20 minutes, according to the logistics manifest. Grissom checked with Owen's supervisor. The supervisor confirmed the timeline. 20 minutes, maybe 25, not 41. So where was Owen for the extra 16 minutes? Grissom returned to the complex. He walked the corridor again. He opened every door. He checked every storage room, every closet, every utility space. Most were locked and required a keycard. Owen had a keycard. In the storage room, where the duffel bag was found, Grissom noticed something he had missed before. The back wall had a ventilation grate near the floor. It was large, roughly 2 feet by 3 feet, secured with 4 screws. Grissom knelt down. He examined the screws. They were clean. No rust. No dust in the threads. He used a screwdriver from his kit. The screws came out easily. Too easily. Behind the grate was a ventilation shaft. It ran horizontally for about 6 feet, then turned upward. Grissom shone his flashlight inside. The shaft was wide enough for a person to crawl through. He could see scratch marks on the metal interior. Fresh. He called for a technical team. They brought cameras, lights, and a small remote drone. They sent the drone into the shaft. It traveled 12 feet, then reached a junction. The shaft branched. One direction led up toward the roof fence. The other led laterally toward the main corridor. The drone followed the lateral path. 30 feet in, the shaft ended at another grate. This grate opened into the ceiling space above the main corridor, directly above the spot where Marcus was last seen on camera. Grissom stood in the corridor and looked up. The ceiling was a drop tile system, standard commercial construction. The tiles could be lifted and moved. Someone in the ceiling space could move freely above the corridor without being seen by the cameras below. He brought in a ladder. He lifted one of the tiles. The space above was dark, cramped, filled with ductwork and electrical conduit, but there was room to move, and there were marks in the dust. Handprints, knee prints, drag marks. Grissom photographed everything. He measured the spacing between the marks. He estimated the weight distribution. Someone had been up there recently. Someone had moved through the space, slowly and deliberately, trying not to make noise. He followed the drag marks. They led from the ventilation shaft junction toward the far end of the corridor, above the emergency exit. But they stopped before reaching the exit. Instead, they turned and led to a different ceiling tile, one positioned above the storage room where the duffel bag was found. Grissom lifted that tile. He shone his light into the space. He saw something wedged between two support beams, a small black backpack. He pulled it down. The backpack was dusty but intact. Inside, he found a coil of nylon rope, a roll of duct tape, 2 zip ties, and a folding knife. He also found a small notebook. The notebook had no name, no identifying information, just pages of handwritten notes. The handwriting was tight, controlled. The notes were timestamps, dates, observations, all related to Marcus Holloway. March 9th, 11:47 p.m. Subject arrives on time. Routine check of perimeter. Returns to office by 12:20 a.m. March 10th, 1003 a.m. Subject makes secondary round. Checks warehouse B loading dock. No deviation. March 14th, 2012 a.m. Subject receives phone call. Speaks for 4 minutes. Returns to monitors. The entries went back 6 weeks. Someone had been watching Marcus, learning his patterns, timing his movements. The final entry was dated the night Marcus disappeared. March 21st, 2:30 a.m. Subject remains in office. Corridor clear. Placement confirmed. Placement. The timer. Grissom sat in his car outside the complex and read the notebook 3 times. The detail was meticulous. Whoever wrote this had spent weeks studying Marcus. They knew his schedule. They knew when he moved, where he went, how long he stayed in each location. But the notebook did not name the author. It did not explain motive. It did not say what happened to Marcus. Grissom requested a handwriting analysis. The lab compared the notebook entries to known samples from everyone with access to the complex: maintenance staff, supervisors, logistics personnel. The analysis came back with a match. The handwriting belonged to Owen Telly. Grissom applied for a search warrant. It took 4 days. When the warrant was approved, he led a team to Owen's home. It was early morning, just after 6. The neighborhood was quiet. Owen answered the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt. He did not resist. He did not ask questions. He stepped aside and let the team enter. They searched for 3 hours. They found nothing in the main living areas. No weapons, no blood, no signs of violence. Owen's wife sat in the kitchen with their 2 children, silent and pale. But in the garage, behind a workbench, they found a locked toolbox. The key was on Owen's keyring. Inside the toolbox were more notebooks, 7 of them, each one filled with the same tight handwriting, each one documenting a different person. 4 of the names Grissom recognized. They were employees at other facilities owned by the same parent company. People who worked night shifts. People who were alone. One of those names was flagged in a missing person database. A warehouse worker named Eric Lomas reported missing 14 months earlier. Last seen leaving his shift at 6:47 a.m. His car was found in the employee parking lot. His phone was on the front seat. He never came home. The case had gone cold. Grissom stood in Owen's garage and felt the air compress. This was not about Marcus Holloway. This was bigger. Owen was arrested. He was read his rights. He was transported to the county facility and placed in an interview room. Grissom let him sit for an hour. Then he went in with a recorder and a folder containing the notebooks. Owen did not ask for his lawyer. He sat with his hands folded on the table, looking at the wall. Grissom placed the folder in front of him. He opened it. He slid the first notebook across the table. He said, "Tell me about Marcus Holloway." Owen looked at the notebook. He did not touch it. He said, "I do not know what you want me to say." Grissom said, "I want you to tell me where he is." Owen shook his head slowly. He said, "I cannot do that." Grissom leaned forward. He said, "You wrote this. You watched him. You documented his every move for 6 weeks. You placed a timer in that corridor to draw him out. You went into the ceiling and you waited. You knew exactly when he would walk into that space. You took him." Owen said nothing. Grissom said, "The rope, the tape, the zip ties. You brought tools. This was not impulsive. This was planned." Owen looked at Grissom for the first time. His face was calm. There was no fear, no anger, just a kind of distant patience. He said, "You do not understand." Grissom said, "Then explain it to me." Owen said, "I needed to know." Grissom waited. Owen said, "I needed to know if I could." The interview lasted 2 more hours. Owen did not confess. He did not provide details. But he did not deny the notebooks. He did not deny the tools. He did not deny being in the complex. What he denied was intent. He claimed the notebooks were a personal project, a study of routines. He claimed the tools were for his own work projects. He claimed he had been in the ceiling space weeks earlier, fixing a ventilation issue that maintenance had missed. He said he had no knowledge of what happened to Marcus Holloway. Grissom did not believe him, but belief was not evidence. The district attorney reviewed the case. They had the notebooks. They had the tools. They had Owen's DNA on the gloves. They had the cell tower data placing him near the complex at the time Marcus disappeared. They had the handwriting analysis. But they did not have a body. They did not have a witness. They did not have a confession. And the physical evidence, while damning, was circumstantial. The DA decided to charge Owen with kidnapping, unlawful restraint, and possession of burglary tools. The trial was set for 8 months out. Grissom kept working. He expanded the search. He cross-referenced the names in the other notebooks with missing person cases across 3 states. He found 2 more matches. Both were men. Both worked night shifts. Both disappeared without explanation, leaving behind their vehicles and personal belongings. He contacted the investigators on those cases. He shared the notebooks. He shared Owen's travel records. Owen had been within 50 miles of each disappearance on the nights they occurred. But still, no bodies, no witnesses, no direct evidence linking Owen to the actual moments of the disappearances. Grissom started receiving calls, anonymous. No voice, just breathing. The calls came at night, always between 2 and 3 in the morning. He traced the numbers, burner phones, untraceable. He began to feel watched. Not paranoia, instinct. He would see the same car in his rear view on different days. He would notice someone standing across the street from his house, just beyond the glow of the streetlights. He filed reports. He documented everything. But there was nothing actionable. 3 months before the trial, Grissom was contacted by a woman named Laura Sen. She identified herself as Owen Talley's former co-worker from a logistics job he held 9 years earlier before he joined the current company. She said she needed to speak with him in person. She would not say why over the phone. They met at a diner 40 miles outside the city. Laura was in her 50s, thin with tired eyes. She ordered coffee and did not touch it. She said, "I saw the news. I saw his face. I knew it was him." Grissom asked what she meant. Laura said that 9 years ago, she and Owen worked the same shift at a distribution center. It was a small operation, only 6 employees on nights. Owen was new, quiet. He kept to himself. One night, Laura stayed late to finish paperwork. Everyone else had left. She was alone in the office when she heard a noise from the warehouse floor. A scraping sound, rhythmic. She went to investigate. She found Owen in the back corner of the warehouse, near the loading dock. He was dragging a heavy-duty trash bin across the floor, slowly, measuring each movement. Laura asked what he was doing. Owen stopped. He looked at her. He said he was testing weight distribution, seeing how much force was needed to move certain loads without making noise. Laura thought it was strange, but she did not press. She went back to the office. 2 weeks later, a delivery driver who serviced the center reported his truck missing. It was found 3 days later, abandoned in a rural area 60 miles away. The driver was never seen again. Police investigated. They questioned everyone at the center, Owen included. He told them he had been home that night. His wife confirmed it. The case went cold. Laura said she never connected the two events, not until she saw Owen's face on the news. Grissom asked if she reported this to the police at the time. Laura said no. She had no proof, just a strange memory. And by the time the driver disappeared, Owen had already left the company. She thought it was a coincidence. But now she was not sure. Grissom took detailed notes. He ran a search for the missing delivery driver. The case file was thin. The driver's name was Todd Pritchard, age 34. No enemies, no debts, no reason to vanish. His truck had been wiped clean. No prints, no DNA. The lead investigator on that case had retired. Grissom tracked him down. The man remembered the case. He said it felt staged, like someone had wanted the truck found, but not the driver. Grissom asked if Owen Talley had ever been a serious suspect. The retired investigator said no, Owen had an alibi. And at the time, there was no reason to look at him closely. He was just another employee. Grissom returned to the notebooks. He read them again, slower this time. He was looking for patterns, not just in what Owen wrote, but in how he wrote. The language, the phrasing. One entry stood out. It was in the notebook documenting Marcus Holloway, dated 2 weeks before the disappearance. Subject shows no awareness of observation. Predictable. Controlled environment ideal for extended study. Removal window. Narrow, but sufficient. Removal. Grissom cross-referenced that phrasing with the other notebooks. The same term appeared in 3 of them. Extended study. Removal window. Owen was not just watching these men. He was planning, calculating, preparing. But preparing for what? Grissom called the forensic psychologist who had been assigned to consult on the case. Her name was Dr. Ellison. She specialized in offender behavior and risk assessment. He asked her to review the notebooks. She spent a week with them. When she called him back, her voice was careful, measured. She said Owen exhibited signs of what she described as control-oriented compulsion. He was not motivated by rage or sexual gratification. He was motivated by the need to dominate a scenario completely, to prove to himself that he could execute a plan without error. She said the notebooks were evidence of rehearsal. Owen was refining his process, learning from each case, improving his technique. She said Marcus Holloway was not the first, and if Owen had not been caught, he would not have been the last. Grissom asked if she believed Marcus was still alive. Dr. Ellison paused. Then she said, based on the pattern, no. The removal was the goal. What happened afterward was likely disposal. Clean, efficient, untraceable. Grissom asked where. Dr. Ellison said, somewhere Owen could access repeatedly without suspicion. Somewhere isolated. Somewhere he had already tested. Grissom pulled Owen's travel logs again. He mapped every location Owen had visited in the 6 months before Marcus disappeared. Work sites, delivery routes, service calls. One location appeared 4 times. A rural access road near a decommissioned quarry, 60 miles west of the complex. The quarry had been abandoned for 12 years. It was gated, but the gate was rusted and easily bypassed. Grissom assembled a search team. They arrived at the quarry on a cold morning. The site was overgrown, silent except for wind moving through the trees. The quarry itself was flooded, a deep black pool surrounded by sheer rock walls. They searched the perimeter. They used cadaver dogs. The dogs alerted near the water's edge, at a spot where the ground sloped down into the pool. Divers were called in. They descended into the water. Visibility was near zero. They worked by touch, moving slowly along the bottom. On the 3rd dive, they found something, a weighted tarp, secured with chains. Inside the tarp was a body. The remains were transported to the medical examiner. Dental records confirmed the identity. Marcus Holloway. Cause of death, asphyxiation. Manner of death, homicide. The medical examiner noted evidence of restraint marks on the wrists and ankles, consistent with zip ties. The body had been submerged for approximately 3 months. Grissom stood in the examination room and felt a kind of cold settle over him. This was not relief. This was confirmation of something he had known but hoped was wrong. Owen Telley was charged with first-degree murder. The trial began 6 months later. The prosecution presented the notebooks, the tools, the DNA evidence, the cell tower data, and the body. They brought in Dr. Ellison to explain Owen's behavior. They brought in Laura Sen to testify about the distribution center incident. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial. They claimed Owen had been in the ceiling space for legitimate maintenance reasons weeks before Marcus disappeared. They claimed the notebooks were misunderstood, that Owen had a habit of documenting routines as a personal coping mechanism for anxiety. They claimed the body could have been placed in the quarry by someone else. The jury deliberated for 4 days. They returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Owen Telley was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Grissom attended the sentencing. Owen stood when the judge read the sentence. His face was blank. He did not react. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. As he passed Grissom, he turned his head slightly. For just a moment, their eyes met. Owen did not smile, but there was something in his expression, a kind of quiet satisfaction. Grissom understood. Owen had succeeded. He had executed his plan. He had removed Marcus Holloway without being seen. The only reason he was caught was because of the timer. A single mistake. A small variable he had not accounted for. But he had proven he could do it. And that, Grissom realized, was enough for him. After the trial, Grissom continued working the other cases. The missing delivery driver, Todd Pritchard. The warehouse worker, Eric Lomas. The 2 others from different states. He coordinated with investigators in those jurisdictions. They searched properties Owen had access to. They interviewed his former co-workers. They reviewed old security footage. They found nothing. No bodies, no evidence, no closure. Owen refused to cooperate. He was offered reduced conditions in exchange for information. He declined. He said he had nothing to share. The cases remain open. Marcus Holloway's family held a private service. His ex-wife spoke briefly to the press. She said Marcus had been a good father, a reliable man, someone who did not deserve what happened to him. She said she hoped other families would not have to wait as long as hers did. Grissom retired 8 months after the sentencing. He had spent 21 years in law enforcement. The Holloway case was his last. He still thinks about the timer, why Owen left it there, whether it was intentional, a signature, or a mistake. He thinks about the notebooks, the care Owen took in documenting every detail, the patience. He thinks about the other names, the ones still missing. And he thinks about the quarry, the dark water, the way the divers described the bottom, cold, silent, deep enough that you could lose anything down there and never find it again. Unless someone wanted you to dot the story, did not end with the verdict. 3 weeks after Owen Talley was transferred to the state correctional facility, Grissom received a letter. No return address. Postmarked from a town he did not recognize. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. The handwriting was not Owen's. The letter said, "You found one. There are 4 more. He keeps maps." That was all. Grissom took the letter to the department. They ran forensic analysis. No prints, no DNA. The paper was standard copy stock, available anywhere. The postmark was from a small town 200 miles north, a place with 1 post office and a population under 3,000. Grissom contacted the local sheriff. He asked if anyone matching Owen Telley's description had been seen in the area. The sheriff checked. No record, no sightings. The letter writer was a ghost. But the message stayed with Grissom. He keeps maps. He returned to Owen's case file. He reviewed every piece of evidence. The notebooks, the tools, the backpack, the storage unit inventory from Owen's home. Everything had been catalogued, photographed, logged. He found no maps. He contacted the evidence custodian. He asked if anything had been missed during the search of Owen's home. The custodian reviewed the logs. Everything had been accounted for. Grissom drove to the correctional facility. He submitted a request to interview Owen. The request was denied. Owen had declined all visitors except his attorney. He had made no statements since sentencing. He spent his days in his cell, reading, writing, saying nothing to the other inmates. Grissom tried a different angle. He contacted Owen's wife, a woman named Stephanie. She had divorced Owen 2 months after the arrest. She had moved with their children to another state. She had changed her name. Grissom found her through a private investigator. He called her. She did not want to talk. He explained the letter. He told her about the 4 others. He asked if Owen had ever kept maps. There was a long silence. Then Stephanie said, "He had a storage unit, one I did not know about." Grissom felt his pulse shift. He asked where. Stephanie said she had found a receipt in Owen's jacket pocket a week after his arrest. It was from a storage facility 30 miles outside the city. She had gone there, thinking maybe he had hidden money or documents. She had used his account number and a bolt cutter. Inside the unit, she found boxes, camping gear, old furniture, nothing that seemed important. But in the back corner, there was a filing cabinet. She opened it. The drawers were filled with folders. Each folder had a label, a name, a date range. Some of the names she recognized from the news, some she did not. She said she panicked. She closed the cabinet. She left. She never told anyone. Grissom asked if the storage unit was still there. Stephanie said she did not know. She had not been back. She had tried to forget everything. Grissom asked for the address. She gave it to him. He drove there the same day. The facility was small, older, the kind of place with no cameras and minimal security. He spoke to the manager. He identified himself. He asked about Owen Telly's unit. The manager checked the records. The unit was still active. It had been paid in advance for 2 years. 18 months remained on the contract. Grissom obtained a warrant. He returned with a forensic team. They cut the lock. They opened the unit. Inside, everything was as Stephanie had described. Boxes, furniture, camping gear, and in the back corner, the filing cabinet. Grissom opened the first drawer. It was filled with folders, 23 of them, each labeled with a name. Marcus Holloway, Eric Lomas, Todd Pritchard, and 20 others. Grissom pulled the folders one by one. Each contained pages of handwritten notes, surveillance logs, photographs, printed satellite maps with locations circled in red, timestamps, license plate numbers, work schedules. The maps were detailed. Some showed rural areas, some showed bodies of water, some showed construction sites, industrial zones, abandoned properties. Each circled location was labeled with a date and a single word: placement. Grissom spread the maps across the floor of the unit. He photographed everything. He counted the circled locations. There were 11 total. 11 places where Owen had buried or submerged someone. The forensic team catalogued every item. The folders were transported to the lab. Grissom coordinated with investigators across 4 states. He matched names from the folders to open missing person cases. 16 of the 20 names matched active cases. The other 4 had never been reported missing. Search teams were dispatched to the circled locations. The first site was a wooded area near a decommissioned railway line. Cadaver dogs alerted within an hour. Excavation began. They found remains buried 4 feet down, wrapped in plastic sheeting. The second site was a man-made pond behind a shuttered factory. Divers recovered a weighted bag from the bottom. Inside were human remains. The third site was a concrete drainage culvert beneath a highway overpass. Remains were found wedged into a narrow section, partially concealed by debris. One by one, the bodies were recovered, 9 in total. Each matched a name from the folders. Each showed signs of restraint. Each had been killed by asphyxiation or blunt force trauma. The remaining 2 circled locations yielded nothing. The ground had been disturbed. Heavy equipment had been used. The sites had been cleared, repurposed, built over. Whatever had been there was gone. Grissom returned to the correctional facility. He submitted another request to interview Owen. This time, he included photographs of the recovered remains. He included copies of the maps. He wrote a single sentence on the request form. "We found them. Tell us about the 2 we missed." The request was approved. Grissom sat across from Owen in a small interview room. Owen was thinner. His hair had grown out. He wore standard issue clothing, wrinkled and faded. He did not look at Grissom when he entered. He sat with his hands on the table, staring at the wall. Grissom placed the folder on the table. He opened it. He slid the photographs across. He said, 9 recovered, 2 missing. Tell me where they are. Owen glanced at the photographs. His face did not change. He said, "Why would I do that?" Grissom said, "Because their families deserve to know." Owen smiled. It was thin, brief. He said, "You still do not understand." Grissom leaned forward. He said, "Then help me understand." Owen was silent for a long time. Then he said, "It was never about them. It was about me. Proving I could plan something perfectly, execute it without error, disappear someone and leave no trace. The families do not matter. The bodies do not matter. What matters is that I succeeded." Grissom said, "You did not succeed. We found them." Owen shook his head slowly. He said, "You found 9. You will never find the other 2. I made sure of that." Grissom said, "Why?" Owen said, "Because I needed to keep something. Some part of this that only I know. You can take everything else. You can recover everybody. You can close every case. But those 2 will stay mine. Forever." The interview ended. Owen was escorted back to his cell. He never spoke to Grissom again. The investigation expanded. Federal agents joined. They analyzed the maps. They used ground-penetrating radar at the 2 sites where nothing had been found. They searched surrounding areas. They interviewed construction crews who had worked at those locations. They pulled permits, blueprints, demolition records. They found nothing. The 2 missing names were Daniel Kerr and Anthony Waite. Daniel had been reported missing 4 years earlier. He was a night janitor at a college campus. He left work at 6 in the morning and never arrived home. His car was found in the campus parking lot. His wallet was on the dashboard. Anthony Waite had never been reported missing. According to the notes in Owen's folder, Anthony was transient. No fixed address, no family, no employer. He had been observed sleeping in a park shelter. Owen had documented his movements for 3 weeks before he vanished. Grissom worked both cases for another year. He traveled to the locations marked on the maps. He walked the terrain. He tried to think like Owen, to see what Owen had seen, to understand his logic. But the sites were too compromised. One had been cleared for a new commercial development. The land had been graded, compacted, paved over. The other had been partially flooded by a drainage project. The water table had risen. Whatever had been there was now submerged under 8 feet of runoff and sediment. Grissom requested a meeting with Owen's ex-wife, Stephanie. She agreed, reluctantly. They met at a neutral location, a coffee shop in the town where she now lived. She looked older, tired. She said her children did not know the full extent of what their father had done. She had told them he was in prison. She had not told them why. Grissom asked if Owen had ever mentioned Daniel Kerr or Anthony Waite. She said no. She had never heard those names. He asked if Owen had ever taken the family on trips to the areas marked on the maps. Stephanie thought about it. She said yes, once, about 5 years ago. They had driven out to a lake for a camping trip. Owen had insisted on a specific campsite. She remembered thinking it was strange because the site was far from the lake, isolated, surrounded by dense trees. Grissom asked if she remembered the name of the lake. She said no, but she remembered the drive. It had taken about 2 hours. The road had been rough, gravel, narrow. Grissom pulled out a state map. He asked her to show him, as best she could, where they had gone. Stephanie studied the map. She pointed to an area in the northern part of the state. She said it was somewhere in this region. She could not be more specific. Grissom thanked her. He spent the next 2 weeks searching that region. He drove every gravel road. He checked every campsite. He found 3 locations that matched Stephanie's description. He searched all 3 with cadaver dogs. They found nothing. He returned to the evidence. He reviewed the folders again. He read every page. He looked for patterns in Owen's language, in the dates, in the details. He found a note in Anthony Waite's folder. It was written in the margin, in small letters, almost invisible. Secondary placement. Redundant security. Deep. Grissom did not understand. He showed it to Dr. Ellison, the forensic psychologist. She studied the note. She said Owen was describing a failsafe, a backup plan. He had anticipated the possibility of being caught. He had ensured that even if investigators found the primary sites, the secondary placements would remain hidden. She said deep suggested burial at an unusual depth, beyond standard search parameters, or placement in a location that would be inaccessible without significant excavation. Grissom returned to the 2 compromised sites. He obtained permits to excavate. Heavy machinery was brought in. They dug 10 feet down at the first site. They found construction debris, concrete, rebar, no remains. At the second site, they drained a section of the flooded area. They dug into the sediment. They found nothing. The searches were called off. The cases were reclassified as cold. Daniel Kerr and Anthony Waite remained missing. Grissom retired shortly after. He had spent 3 years on the case. He had recovered 9 bodies. He had secured a conviction. But the 2 missing names haunted him. He kept copies of the folders. He kept the maps. He studied them in his home office late at night when he could not sleep. He noticed something he had missed before. In Anthony Waite's folder, there was a photograph. It showed Anthony sitting on a bench in a park. The photograph was taken from a distance. In the background, barely visible, was a sign. Grissom enlarged the photograph. He enhanced the image. The sign read, Westfield Community Park. He looked up the park. It was 40 miles south of the city. He drove there. He walked the grounds. He found the bench where Anthony had been photographed. Behind the bench was a maintenance shed. It was old, wooden, padlocked. Grissom looked through the window. Inside were tools, lawn equipment, a workbench. He contacted the parks department. He asked who had access to the shed. They checked their records. The shed was serviced by a private contractor, the same contractor who handled maintenance at several other municipal properties. Grissom requested the contractor's name. He ran a background check. The contractor's company was small, 3 employees. One of them was a man named Leon Dre. Leon had worked for the company for 6 years. Before that, he had worked in logistics for the same parent company that employed Owen Talley. Grissom pulled Leon's employment records. Leon and Owen had overlapped at 2 facilities. They had worked different shifts, but they had been on site at the same time, on multiple occasions. Grissom requested an interview with Leon. Leon agreed to meet at his home. He was cooperative, calm. Grissom asked if he knew Owen Talley. Leon said he remembered the name. He had seen it in the news. He said he might have crossed paths with Owen at work, but he did not recall any specific interactions. Grissom asked if Leon had ever noticed anything unusual about Owen. Leon said no. Grissom asked if Leon had access to the maintenance shed at Westfield Community Park. Leon said yes. He serviced that shed regularly. Grissom asked if he had ever noticed anything out of place in or around the shed. Leon said no. The interview lasted 30 minutes. Grissom left with more questions than answers. He obtained a warrant to search the shed. The search was conducted 2 days later. The interior was cramped, filled with equipment. The floor was dirt, compacted and uneven. Cadaver dogs were brought in. They alerted in the back corner of the shed. Excavation began. They dug 3 feet down. They found a plastic tarp, wrapped tightly and secured with rope. Inside were human remains. Dental records confirmed the identity: Anthony Waite. Leon Dre was brought in for questioning. He was read his rights. He requested an attorney. The interview did not yield a confession. Leon maintained that he had no knowledge of the remains. He claimed he had not been involved. He claimed someone else must have accessed the shed. But his phone records placed him near the park on the night Anthony Waite disappeared. His vehicle was captured on a traffic camera 3 blocks from the park at 2014 a.m. Leon was charged as an accessory to murder. The trial is still pending. Grissom stood outside the shed on the day the remains were recovered. He watched the forensic team work. He thought about Owen, about the notebooks, about the phrase secondary placement. Owen had not worked alone. He had recruited someone who could help him move bodies, someone who could provide access, someone who could keep a secret. Leon was that person. But there was still one name missing: Daniel Kerr. Grissom returned to Leon's employment records. He mapped every property Leon had serviced in the past 5 years. He cross-referenced those locations with the dates in Daniel Kerr's folder. One location matched: a community college campus, the same campus where Daniel had worked as a night janitor. Leon had been contracted to service the campus grounds. He had access to maintenance areas, storage buildings, utility tunnels. Grissom coordinated with campus security. They reviewed old access logs. Leon's keycard had been used to enter a maintenance building on the night Daniel Kerr disappeared. Grissom obtained another warrant. The building was searched. Cadaver dogs alerted near a utility access hatch in the basement. The hatch led to a crawl space beneath the building. Inside the crawl space, they found remains: Daniel Kerr. Leon Dre was charged with 2 counts of accessory to murder. He was also charged with obstruction of justice and evidence tampering. Owen Telly was brought back to court. Additional charges were filed. He was linked to the deaths of Anthony Waite and Daniel Kerr through the maps, the folders, and the testimony of forensic experts. Owen did not fight the charges. He stood silently as the judge read the updated sentence: life without parole, consecutive terms. As he was led out of the courtroom, he turned to look at Grissom one last time. There was no satisfaction in his face now, only something colder: resignation maybe, or acceptance. Grissom never saw him again. The case was closed. All 11 victims had been recovered. All families had been notified. All suspects had been charged. But the work did not feel finished. Grissom kept the files. He kept the maps. He kept the letter that had arrived 3 weeks after the verdict. You found one. There are 4 more. He keeps maps. The letter writer had been right, but there had been 10 more, not 4. Grissom wondered if the letter writer had known, if they had been testing him, or warning him. He never found out. The letter remained anonymous. He spent his retirement organizing the case files. He wrote detailed reports. He submitted them to the National Database for Unsolved Cases. He hoped other investigators could learn from what he had learned. He hoped no one else would have to search as long as he did. But late at night, when the house was quiet, he still thought about Owen's words. You will never find the other 2. I made sure of that. Owen had been wrong, but the fact that he had believed it, that he had taken satisfaction in keeping something hidden, stayed with Grissom. It reminded him that some people do not commit crimes for money, or revenge, or passion. They do it because they need to prove they can. They need to control something completely. They need to win. And even when they lose, they find ways to claim victory. That is what made Owen dangerous. Not rage, not impulse, calculation. Grissom thought about the other names in the folders. the 16 who had been reported missing, the 4 who had not. He thought about how many people disappear every year, how many cases go cold, how many families never get answers. He thought about the investigators who would come after him, the ones who would open old files and find threads he had missed. He hoped they would pull those threads. He hoped they would not give up. Because the work is never really finished. There is always one more name, one more map, one more place someone decided was deep enough to hide the truth. And someone has to be willing to dig. 6 months after the final convictions, Grissom received another letter. This one had a return address, a name he did not recognize, Paula Vickers. The postmark was local, from a suburb 15 miles outside the city. The letter was handwritten, careful and neat. It said, "I worked with Owen Talley 12 years ago. I need to talk to you. There is something you should know. Please call me." A phone number was written at the bottom. Grissom hesitated. He was retired. The case was closed. Every victim had been found. Every charge had been filed. He had spent 3 years inside this investigation, and it had cost him sleep, health, and a part of himself he was not sure he would get back. But he called the number. Paula answered on the second ring. Her voice was older, cautious. She said she had been following the case in the news. She said she almost reached out during the trial, but she had been afraid of what it would mean, afraid of being involved. Grissom asked what she wanted to tell him. Paula said she needed to meet in person. She would not talk over the phone. They met 2 days later at a library in her town. Paula was in her early 60s, grey hair pulled back, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She looked like someone who had spent a long time deciding whether to speak. She sat across from Grissom at a table near the back. She folded her hands and did not make eye contact at first. She said, "I worked at a call center 12 years ago. Owen was in the scheduling department. We did not interact much. He was quiet, kept to himself. But I remember him because of something that happened." Grissom waited. Paula said there was another employee, a woman named Bryn Coulter. She worked nights, same as Owen. She was in her 20s. Friendly. She talked to everyone. One week, Bryn stopped showing up. No call, no message. Her supervisor tried reaching her. No answer. They sent someone to her apartment. The landlord let them in. The apartment was empty, not just vacant, cleared out, furniture gone, clothes gone. No sign she had ever lived there. Her car was gone too. Her bank account had been closed 3 days before she disappeared. A cashier's check had been issued for the remaining balance, $1,700. The assumption was that Bryn had left on her own, that she had planned it. Maybe she was running from something. Maybe she just wanted to start over. But Paula did not believe that. She said Bryn had talked about going back to school. She had talked about her cat. She had talked about visiting her sister in another state. She did not sound like someone planning to vanish. Paula said she mentioned this to the police when they came to the call center to ask questions. The officer took notes. He said they would look into it, but nothing came of it. Grissom asked what this had to do with Owen. Paula said, "The day before Bryn disappeared, I saw Owen in the parking lot. He was standing by Bryn's car, just standing there, looking at it. I thought it was strange, but I did not say anything. I figured maybe they were friends. The next day, Bryn was gone, and Owen acted like nothing had happened. He came to work. He did his job. He did not ask about her. He did not seem curious. Everyone else was talking about it. Where did she go? Why did she leave? But Owen never said a word. Grissom asked if Paula had told the police about seeing Owen by the car. Paula said no. At the time, she did not think it mattered. It was just a moment, a strange moment, but not evidence. Now, after everything she had seen in the news, she thought it mattered. Grissom took notes. He asked for Bryn Coulter's full name, date of birth, last known address. Paula provided everything she could remember. He thanked her. He said he would look into it. Paula said, "I do not know if this helps, but I had to tell someone. I have thought about it for 12 years. I should have said something then." Grissom said, "You are saying something now. That counts." He returned home and pulled up the missing person database. He searched for Bryn Coulter. No record, no case file, no report. He widened the search. He checked state records, driver's license, vehicle registration, bank accounts, social security activity. Bryn Coulter had not used her social security number in 12 years. No tax filings, no employment records, no address changes. She had effectively disappeared from every system. Grissom contacted the police department that had jurisdiction over the area where Bryn had lived. He identified himself. He asked if they had any record of a missing person report for Bryn Coulter from 12 years ago. The records clerk searched. She found nothing. No report had been filed. Grissom asked if there was any way a report could have been filed and not logged. The clerk said it was unlikely, but not impossible. Older records had been digitized, and some entries had been lost or misfiled during the transition. Grissom requested a manual search of archived paper files. It took 3 weeks. The clerk called him back. She said she found a single page, a welfare check request initiated by Bryn's employer. The officer who responded had noted that the apartment was vacant and the subject had moved. No follow-up was deemed necessary. No missing person report had ever been filed. Grissom sat with that information. If Bryn had left on her own, that would explain the closed bank account, the cleared apartment, but it did not explain the timing. It did not explain Owen standing by her car the day before she vanished. He pulled Owen's employment records from 12 years ago. Owen had worked at the call center for 8 months. He left 2 weeks after Bryn disappeared. No notice. He just stopped showing up. The company marked him as voluntarily terminated. Grissom cross-referenced the dates. Bryn disappeared on a Thursday. Owen stopped coming to work the following Monday. 10 days later, he started a new job at a logistics company 60 miles away. Grissom tried to find Bryn's family. Her emergency contact at the call center had been listed as her sister, a woman named Michelle Coulter. No phone number, no address. He searched public records. He found a Michelle Coulter living in a town 3 states away. He called. The woman who answered said yes, she had a sister named Bryn, but they had not spoken in over a decade. Grissom asked why. Michelle said Bryn had called her 12 years ago. She said she was leaving. She said she needed to start over. She said she would be in touch when she was settled. Michelle never heard from her again. Grissom asked if Bryn had sounded upset, scared, pressured. Michelle thought about it. She said no. Bryn had sounded calm, maybe a little distant, but not afraid. Grissom asked if Bryn had ever mentioned Owen Telly. Michelle said the name did not sound familiar. Grissom thanked her. He asked if she would be willing to provide a DNA sample in case it became necessary to identify remains. Michelle was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You think she is dead?" Grissom said, "I do not know, but I want to be prepared." Michelle agreed. She submitted a sample to a local lab. It was entered into the national database. Grissom returned to the maps Owen had kept in the storage unit. He reviewed every circled location. He checked the dates. None of them matched the time frame of Bryn's disappearance. But there was one folder in the filing cabinet that had no name on the label, just a date. 12 years ago. Inside the folder were 3 pages, surveillance notes, a photograph of a parking lot, a handwritten timeline. The photograph showed a woman standing by a car. The image was taken from a distance, slightly out of focus. Grissom enlarged it. The woman had dark hair, average height, wearing a jacket and jeans. He compared the photograph to Bryn Coulter's driver's license photo. The resolution was poor, but the resemblance was close. Same build, same hair color. The surveillance notes were brief. They documented Bryn's schedule, when she arrived at work, when she left, where she parked. The notes spanned 2 weeks. The final entry was dated the day before Bryn disappeared. Subject routine established. Minimal social contact. Apartment isolated. Removal feasible. Grissom felt the air tighten. This was Owen's earliest work, his first victim. But the folder contained no map, no circled location, no placement note. Bryn Coulter's body had never been found, and Owen had not documented where he put her. Grissom submitted a request to interview Owen again. He included the folder. He included the photograph. He wrote a single question on the request form. Where is Bryn Coulter? The request was denied. Owen's attorney had advised him to cease all communication with law enforcement. Owen would not speak. Grissom tried another approach. He contacted Leon Dre's attorney. He asked if Leon would be willing to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. He told the attorney about Bryn Coulter. The attorney said Leon had no knowledge of any victim named Bryn. Leon had only been involved in the later cases. He had met Owen 6 years ago, not 12. Grissom was at a dead end. He returned to the surveillance notes. He read them again, slowly. He looked for patterns in the language. He compared them to the notes in the other folders. One phrase stood out. Apartment isolated. He pulled up Bryn's last known address. It was a small complex on the edge of town, surrounded by vacant lots and a stretch of undeveloped land. The complex had been torn down 8 years ago. A shopping center had been built in its place. Grissom drove there. He walked the parking lot. He tried to picture what the area had looked like 12 years ago. He checked old satellite images online. The complex had been a cluster of low-rise buildings, 2 stories, with a shared courtyard and a small maintenance shed in the back. The shed. Grissom requested the demolition records for the property. He found the permit. The demolition had been completed 8 years ago. The debris had been cleared and the site had been graded for new construction. He contacted the demolition company. He asked if they kept records of what had been found during the teardown. The company said they kept logs for major finds, hazardous materials, anything unusual, but small items were generally discarded. Grissom asked if they remembered finding human remains. The representative said no, absolutely not. That would have been reported immediately. Grissom thanked them and ended the call. He thought about Owen's process, the care he took, the redundancy, the fail-safes. If Owen had killed Bryn 12 years ago, before he had refined his methods, he might have made mistakes. He might have chosen a location that was temporary, a location that would not last. Or he might have chosen a location that would be destroyed, ensuring the body would never be found. Grissom requested ground-penetrating radar surveys of the shopping center lot. The request was denied. The property owner refused access. There was no probable cause for a search warrant. Grissom pursued it anyway. He filed motions. He presented the folder. He presented the surveillance notes. He argued that Bryn Coulter was a likely victim and that her remains could be beneath the current structure. The motions were denied. The evidence was too circumstantial. The folder proved Owen had watched Bryn, but it did not prove he had killed her. And without a body, there was no murder. Grissom spent 6 months fighting. He appealed. He brought in experts. He contacted victim advocacy groups. He tried to generate media attention. Nothing worked. The case remained open, but inactive. Bryn Coulter was still classified as a voluntary missing person. No foul play suspected. Grissom could not let it go. He started visiting the shopping center. He would sit in his car and watch people come and go. He would walk the lot at night when it was empty and try to imagine what had been there before. He thought about the maintenance shed, about how Owen had used sheds before, about how he had hidden Anthony Waite in a shed at the park. He pulled up the construction plans for the shopping center. He studied the layout. The parking lot had been expanded. It now covered the area where the apartment complex courtyard had been. The maintenance shed would have been in the northwest corner, near the loading zone. Grissom marked the spot. He returned at night with a flashlight and a small shovel. He knew it was illegal. He knew it would not hold up in court, but he had to know. He dug in the corner of the lot, near a row of dumpsters. The ground was compacted, layered with asphalt and gravel. He dug through the top layer. He found concrete beneath, rebar, foundation remnants from the old complex. He dug deeper, 6 inches, a foot, 18 inches. His hands ached, his back burned. He found nothing. He filled the hole and left. 2 weeks later, he received a call from Michelle Coulter. She said she had been contacted by a detective from another state. The detective had found remains. A body had been discovered during a highway expansion project. The remains were female, estimated age mid-20s, buried in a shallow grave beneath an old access road. DNA testing was underway. Michelle had been notified because her sample was in the database. She asked Grissom if he thought it was Bryn. Grissom said he did not know, but he would find out. The DNA results came back 3 weeks later. The remains were not Bryn Coulter. They were another woman, unidentified, no match in any database. Grissom requested the case file. He reviewed the details. The woman had been buried 12 years ago. The location was 60 miles from where Bryn had lived. The cause of death was asphyxiation. The method matched Owen Talley's pattern. Grissom contacted the detective handling the case. He shared Owen's files. He shared the maps. He asked if Owen had any connection to that area. The detective checked. Owen had worked at a distribution center 20 miles from the burial site. He had been employed there for 4 months, 12 years ago. He left shortly after Bryn Coulter disappeared. The timeline matched. Grissom asked if Owen had ever been questioned about the unidentified woman. The detective said no. The body had only just been found. Owen had never been on their radar. Grissom provided everything he had: the notebooks, the folders, the surveillance notes. He told the detective about Bryn Coulter. He told him about the apartment complex. He told him about the missing map. The detective said he would investigate. He would add the unidentified remains to Owen's case file. He would attempt to identify the woman. But as for Bryn Coulter, there was still no evidence. No body. No proof. Grissom hung up and sat in his office. He looked at the files spread across his desk. 12 years of work. 11 bodies recovered. 2 still missing. Bryn Coulter. And now, an unidentified woman. He thought about Owen's words again. You will never find the other 2. I made sure of that. Owen had been wrong about Anthony Waite and Daniel Kerr, but he might have been right about Bryn. Grissom did not know if he would ever find her. He did not know if the shopping center held her remains, or if Owen had placed her somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that no longer existed. Somewhere that had been paved over, built on, erased. He thought about the letter he had received 6 months after the verdict. You found one. There are 4 more. He keeps maps. The letter writer had known. They had known Owen had more victims. They had known about the maps. But they had not known about Bryn, or the unidentified woman, or any of the others who might still be missing. Grissom wondered how many there were, how many names Owen had never written down, how many people he had taken before he started keeping records. He wondered if Owen had started with Bryn, if she had been his first, if that was why there was no map, because he had not yet learned to document everything, because he was still figuring out his process. Or maybe Owen had simply decided that some victims did not need to be recorded, that some disappearances were better left as mysteries, that the satisfaction came not from documenting, but from knowing he had succeeded without leaving a trace. Grissom closed the files. He turned off the light. He left the office. He did not stop thinking about Bryn Coulter. He did not stop wondering where she was. But he accepted that some questions do not have answers. Some cases do not close. And sometimes the only thing you can do is make sure people remember. Make sure the names are not forgotten. Make sure someone keeps looking. even when the trail goes cold. Because that is the job, not to solve every case, not to recover every victim, but to keep trying, to keep pulling threads, to keep digging, even when the ground is hard and the light is gone. That is what justice looks like. Not a verdict, not a conviction, but the refusal to give up, the refusal to let someone vanish without being remembered. Grissom thought about Marcus Holloway, about the timer, about the single mistake Owen had made that unraveled everything. He thought about the families who had waited years for answers, who had been told their loved ones were gone, but had never known how, or why, or where. He thought about the two names still missing, Bryn Coulter and the unidentified woman. He thought about the next investigator who would open these files, who would see the gaps, who would ask the same questions. And he hoped they would find what he could not, because the work is never finished. There is always one more name, one more thread, one more place someone decided was hidden enough. And someone has to be willing to keep looking. 18 months after Grissom closed his office for the last time, a construction crew working on a municipal water line expansion made a discovery. They were digging in an area that had once been industrial land, now rezoned for residential development. The excavation was routine. A backhoe operator named Ray Cossett was clearing soil when his bucket struck something solid. He assumed it was rock or old concrete. He adjusted the angle and dug again. The bucket pulled up fabric, dark, rotted, tangled with roots. Ray stopped the machine. He climbed down. He looked into the trench. He saw what the fabric was wrapped around. He called his supervisor. The supervisor called the police. The remains were human, female. The medical examiner estimated the body had been in the ground for approximately 10 to 12 years. Cause of death could not be determined due to decomposition, but the position of the remains suggested the body had been bound at the time of burial. The location was 3 miles from the apartment complex where Bryn Coulter had lived. Grissom received a call from the detective handling the case. The detective said they were running DNA. They had a potential match in the database, Michelle Coulter's sample. Grissom asked how long the results would take. The detective said 2 weeks, maybe 3. Grissom asked if he could see the site. The detective said yes. Grissom drove out the next morning. The area was cordoned off with yellow tape. A forensic team was still working the scene, sifting through soil, photographing, documenting. The trench was deep, roughly 8 feet, running parallel to a stretch of cracked asphalt that had once been a service road. Grissom stood at the edge and looked down. The earth was dark, layered with clay and sediment. The fabric had been mostly removed, but fragments remained, clinging to the soil. The detective approached. He said the body had been placed in a shallow grave, about 4 feet deep, then covered with a tarp and weighted with stones. Over time, the grave had settled. The recent excavation had brought it to the surface. Grissom asked if there was any identification with the remains. The detective said no. No personal effects, no jewelry, nothing. Grissom asked if the site matched any of Owen's maps. The detective said no. This location had never appeared in Owen's files. If it was Owen's work, he had never documented it. Grissom thought about the folder with no name. the one that contained surveillance notes on Bryn Coulter, the one with no map. He asked if the detective had reviewed that folder. The detective said yes. He was aware. That was why they were running the DNA against Michelle Coulter's sample. Grissom asked if Owen had been questioned. The detective said a request had been submitted. Owen's attorney had declined. Owen would not speak. 2 weeks later, the DNA results came back. The remains were a match. Bryn Coulter. Grissom sat in his kitchen when he received the call. He did not feel relief. He did not feel satisfaction. He felt something heavier. Confirmation, maybe. Or just the weight of knowing. Bryn had been gone for 12 years. Her sister had spent 12 years wandering. And now she had an answer. Not the answer anyone wanted, but an answer. Michelle Coulter was notified. She requested that Bryn's remains be released for burial. A small service was held 3 weeks later. Grissom attended. He sat in the back. He did not speak. He just listened as Michelle stood at the front and talked about her sister. About how Bryn had wanted to go back to school. About how she had loved animals. About how she had called that last time and said she was leaving. And Michelle had believed her. Michelle said she wished she had asked more questions. She wished she had insisted on knowing where Bryn was going. She wished she had not accepted the distance. But Bryn had sounded calm, and Michelle had assumed everything was fine. After the service, Michelle approached Grissom. She thanked him. She said she knew he had tried to find Bryn years ago. She said she appreciated that someone had kept looking. Grissom said he wished he had found her sooner. Michelle said, "At least, now I know. That is something." Grissom nodded. He did not know what else to say. Owen Telly was charged with the murder of Bryn Coulter. The charge was added to his existing sentence. He did not contest it. He did not respond. The unidentified woman from the highway expansion remained unidentified. Her DNA was run through every database. No match. No missing person report that fit the profile. She was estimated to be between 24 and 29 years old at the time of death. She had been buried in the same time frame as Bryn Coulter. Grissom requested access to Owen's employment records from that period. He mapped every location Owen had worked, every site he had serviced, every route he had traveled. He found no clear connection. The woman could have been from anywhere within a 200-mile radius. He requested a facial reconstruction. A forensic artist used the skull to create a clear approximation of what the woman might have looked like. The reconstruction was released to the media. Posters were distributed. Tips were requested. 3 people called in. All 3 tips were investigated. None led anywhere. The woman remained Jane Doe. Grissom thought about her often. He thought about how she had been someone, how she had a name, a family, a life, how she had been taken and buried and forgotten, how even now, with her remains recovered, no one knew who she was. He thought about how many others there might be, how many people Owen had taken before he started keeping records, how many graves had not been found, how many names had been erased. He requested a meeting with Dr. Ellison, the forensic psychologist. He wanted to understand Owen's progression. He wanted to know if there was a pattern to the early victims, something that could help identify others. Dr. Ellison agreed to meet. They sat in her office. Grissom spread out the files, the notebooks, the folders, the photographs. Dr. Ellison reviewed them carefully. She took her time. She made notes. When she finished, she said Owen's behavior showed clear escalation. The early victims, Bryn and the unidentified woman, had been taken opportunistically. Owen had watched them, learned their routines, and acted when the opportunity presented itself. But he had not yet developed the meticulous planning that characterized his later work. She said the lack of documentation suggested Owen was still experimenting, still learning what worked and what did not. The fact that both early victims had been buried in locations that were later disturbed, either by construction or excavation, suggested Owen had not yet understood the importance of site selection. She said it was likely there were others, people Owen had taken during this experimental phase, people whose remains had not been found because the graves were in locations that had been compromised or forgotten. Grissom asked how many. Dr. Ellison said she could not give a number, but based on Owen's behavior, she estimated at least 3 to 5 additional victims in the years before he started keeping detailed records. Grissom asked if there was any way to identify them. Dr. Ellison said only if their remains were found, or if someone came forward with information. Grissom thanked her. He left the office and sat in his car for a long time. He thought about the number, 3 to 5, maybe more. He thought about the families who did not know, who were still waiting, who had filed missing person reports and received no answers. He pulled up the national database. He searched for missing persons cases from the time frame when Owen had been active in the early years. He filtered by gender, age range, geographic area. He found 43 names. 43 people who had disappeared during the same period. 43 people who could have crossed paths with Owen. 43 potential victims. Grissom knew he could not investigate all of them. He did not have the resources. He did not have the authority. He was retired. This was no longer his job. But he could not walk away. He started with the cases closest to the locations where Owen had worked. He requested case files. He reviewed reports. He looked for patterns. People who worked night shifts, people who lived alone, people whose disappearances had been classified as voluntary. He found 6 cases that matched the profile. He contacted the investigators on those cases. He shared Owen's files. He asked if they would be willing to reopen the investigations. 3 investigators agreed. 3 did not. They said the cases were too old. The evidence was too thin. There was no budget for cold cases. Grissom worked with the 3 who agreed. They cross-referenced Owen's travel logs. They mapped his routes. They looked for overlaps. One case stood out. A woman named Teresa Wynne. She had disappeared 13 years ago, a year before Bryn Coulter. She had worked as a night clerk at a gas station. She left her shift at 6 in the morning and never made it home. Her car was found abandoned on the side of a rural highway, keys in the ignition, purse on the passenger seat. The initial investigation had found no evidence of foul play. No blood, no struggle. The assumption was that Teresa had walked away. Maybe she had been picked up by someone she knew. Maybe she had left voluntarily. But her family never believed that. They said Teresa had a daughter. She would not have left her daughter. Grissom pulled Owen's employment records from 13 years ago. Owen had been working at a distribution center 30 miles from the gas station where Teresa worked. His shift ended at 5 in the morning. Grissom mapped the route from the distribution center to Owen's home. It passed directly by the gas station where Teresa worked. He contacted the investigator on Teresa's case. He shared the information. He asked if the investigator would request a search of properties along Owen's route. The investigator said he would try, but he warned Grissom that most of the properties had changed hands. Some had been sold, some had been demolished. The chances of finding anything were slim. Grissom said he understood, but he asked the investigator to try anyway. 3 months later, the investigator called back. He said they had searched a property that had belonged to a farming family 13 years ago. The property had been sold twice since then. The current owners had no knowledge of anything unusual. But during the search, cadaver dogs had alerted near an old barn. The barn had been used for equipment storage. It was partially collapsed, overgrown with weeds. The search team had excavated beneath the barn floor. They had found remains. Female, estimated age late 20s. The body had been wrapped in plastic and buried beneath a layer of concrete. DNA testing was underway. Grissom asked if Owen had any connection to the property. The investigator said yes. Owen had worked there briefly. The farming family had hired him to help with the delivery of supplies. He had been on the property for 2 days, 13 years ago. The timeline matched Teresa Wynn's disappearance. The DNA results came back positive. The remains were Teresa Wynn. Her family was notified. A service was held. Grissom did not attend. He did not know Teresa. He had never met her family. But he read the obituary. He learned that Teresa had been 28 years old when she disappeared. She had been studying to become a veterinary technician. She had a daughter who is now 16. Owen Telly was charged with the murder of Teresa Wynn. He did not respond. Grissom continued working the other cases. One more victim was identified. A man named Carl Mundy. He had disappeared 14 years ago. He had worked as a night security guard at a storage facility. His shift had ended at 7 in the morning. He never clocked out. His car was found in the employee lot. His keys were on the front seat. The investigation had gone nowhere. Carl had no family. No one filed a missing person report for 3 weeks. By then, the trail was cold. Grissom found that Owen had rented a storage unit at the same facility where Carl worked. The rental records showed Owen had accessed the unit multiple times during the week Carl disappeared. A search team was dispatched to the facility. The unit Owen had rented had long since been cleared and re-rented, but cadaver dogs alerted near the perimeter fence behind the building. Excavation revealed remains. Male. Estimated age mid-40s. Cause of death, blunt force trauma to the skull. DNA testing confirmed the identity. Carl Mundy. Owen was charged with Carl's murder. He did not respond. Grissom stood in his office and looked at the updated case board. 14 victims identified. 14 families with answers. 14 lives that had been taken by one man who had decided he needed to prove he could. But there were still gaps. The unidentified woman from the highway expansion, and possibly others. People whose names had never been connected. People whose remains had not been found. Grissom thought about the letter he had received after the first conviction. You found one. There are 4 more. He keeps maps. The letter writer had known, but Grissom had never identified them. The letter had been anonymous, untraceable. He wondered if the letter writer had been a victim who escaped, or someone who had known Owen and suspected, or someone who had seen something and stayed silent until they could not anymore. He wondered if there were others like that, people who knew, people who had seen Owen and felt something was wrong but never said anything. He thought about Paula Vickers, who had waited 12 years to come forward, who had seen Owen standing by Bryn's car and thought it was strange, but said nothing. He thought about how many opportunities there had been to stop Owen. How many small moments where someone could have spoken up, could have asked a question, could have looked a little closer. But no one did, because Owen was quiet, because he was careful, because he did not fit the profile of what people expected a killer to look like. Grissom thought about that, about how danger does not always announce itself, about how the most dangerous people are often the ones who blend in, who seem normal, who do their jobs and go home and live ordinary lives while carrying out extraordinary violence. He thought about the victims, about how they had been chosen not because of who they were, but because of where they were, because they worked nights, because they were alone, because Owen saw an opportunity and took it. They had done nothing wrong. They had simply existed in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that, Grissom thought, was the cruelest part, the randomness of it. The fact that any of them could have been spared if they had taken a different shift, if they had parked in a different spot, if they had left 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later. But they had not, and Owen had been there, watching, waiting. Grissom closed the case files. He turned off the light. He left the office. He did not stop thinking about the unidentified woman. He did not stop wondering if there were others, but he accepted that some names would never be recovered. Some graves would never be found. And the only thing left to do was make sure the ones who had been found were remembered, make sure their families had answers, make sure their deaths were not forgotten. That was the job. Not to save everyone, not to solve everything, but to keep trying, to keep looking, to keep pulling threads until there were no more threads to pull. And then to pass the work to the next person, to make sure the files stayed open, to make sure someone kept asking questions. Because that is how justice works, not in a single moment, not in a single verdict, but in the slow, steady accumulation of answers, in the refusal to give up, in the insistence that every name matters, every life matters, every victim deserves to be found. Grissom thought about Marcus Holloway, the man whose disappearance had started all of this, the security guard who walked into a corridor at 2047 in the morning and never walked out. He thought about the timer, the small object that had unraveled everything, the single mistake Owen had made. And he thought about how close Owen had come to getting away with it, How if the timer had not been found, Marcus's case might have stayed cold, and all the others might have stayed hidden. One small object, one thread, one investigator willing to pull it. That was all it took. Grissom turned off the lights and walked out into the rain. The years passed quietly after that. Grissom no longer worked cases. He no longer visited crime scenes or sat across from suspects in interview rooms. He had given everything he could to the investigation, and now it belonged to others. But the work did not stop. New investigators took over the remaining cold cases. They used Grissom's files. They followed the threads he had started. They reached out when they had questions, and Grissom answered when he could. 3 years after Teresa Wynn's remains were found, another body was discovered. This one was in a different state, buried beneath an old service station that was being demolished. The remains were male, estimated age early 30s, buried approximately 15 years ago. DNA was run. No match in the database. The man became another John Doe. But the method matched Owen's pattern: plastic wrapping, weighted burial, remote location. The investigator contacted Grissom. He asked if Grissom had any records that might connect Owen to that area 15 years ago. Grissom checked. Owen had worked at a trucking depot 90 miles from the service station. The job had lasted only 6 weeks. Owen had been fired for repeated absences. The investigator requested employment records. The absences had occurred on weekends. 3 consecutive weekends. No explanation provided. The investigator mapped the area. The service station was on a route between the depot and a small town where Owen's wife had family. Owen and his wife had visited that town twice during the period he worked at the depot. The investigator searched missing person reports from that time frame. He found one, a man named Martin Hayes, age 31, last seen leaving a bar near the service station. His truck was found in the parking lot the next morning. Keys missing. Wallet missing. Martin was never seen again. Martin's family had filed a report. The case had been investigated. No leads, no suspects. The assumption was that Martin had gotten into a vehicle with someone, willingly or not, and disappeared. The investigator requested dental records. They were compared to the remains found beneath the service station. Positive match. Martin Hayes. Owen Telly was charged with the murder of Martin Hayes. 15 victims now. 15 lives taken over a span of more than a decade. Owen did not respond to the charge. He had stopped responding to anything years ago. He sat in his cell. He read. He wrote. He did not speak to other inmates. He did not participate in programs. He simply existed. Grissom heard about the charge through the investigator. He added Martin Hayes to his records. He updated the case board he still kept in his home office, even though he no longer needed it. He stood in front of the board and looked at the names. 15 victims identified, 1 unidentified woman, and an unknown number still missing. He thought about Owen's silence, about how Owen had stopped talking after the first trial, how he had refused to answer questions, how he had kept his secrets even when there was nothing left to gain. Grissom wondered if Owen still felt that quiet satisfaction, if he still believed he had won something, if the fact that some victims remained hidden gave him a sense of control, even from behind bars. Or if Owen had simply moved on, if the need to prove himself had been satisfied, if the game was over and there was nothing left to say. Grissom did not know. He would never know. But he knew this. Owen Telly would spend the rest of his life in prison. He would die there. And when he died, any secrets he still held would die with him. That was the reality. Some answers would never come. Some families would never know. Some names would remain in the missing person database forever, unresolved, unexplained. Grissom had made peace with that, or he had tried to. 4 years after Martin Hayes was identified, Grissom received a phone call from a journalist. The journalist was writing a book about the case. She wanted to interview Grissom. She wanted to understand how the investigation had unfolded. She wanted to tell the story of the victims. Grissom agreed. They met at a cafe. The journalist was young, serious, prepared. She had done her research. She knew the details. She asked careful questions. Grissom answered them. He walked her through the timeline. He explained how Marcus Holloway's disappearance had led to the discovery of the notebooks, how the notebooks had led to the storage unit, how the storage unit had led to the maps, how the maps had led to the bodies. He told her about the victims, about their lives, about how they had been chosen not because of who they were, but because they were vulnerable, alone, easy to watch, easy to take. He told her about the families, about the years they had waited, about the relief and the grief that came when the waiting finally ended. The journalist asked if Grissom had any regrets. Grissom thought about it. He said he wished he had found Bryn Coulter sooner. He wished he had pushed harder when the apartment complex was still standing. He wished he had trusted his instincts about Owen earlier. But regret, he said, was not useful. You could only move forward. You could only do the work in front of you and hope it was enough. The journalist asked if Grissom thought there were more victims. Grissom said yes. He believed there were. He believed Owen had killed before Bryn Coulter. He believed there were people whose names had never been connected, people whose remains had not been found. The journalist asked if those cases would ever be solved. Grissom said he did not know, but he hoped someone would keep looking. He hoped the files would stay open. He hoped the next investigator, or the one after that, would find something he had missed. The book was published a year later. It was thorough, respectful. It told the story of the victims, not the killer. It honored their lives, not his violence. Grissom read it once. He did not read it again. He did not need to. He had lived it. He had carried it for years. And now it was written down. Now it was documented. Now it would be remembered. That was enough. 5 years after the book was published, Grissom received another letter. This one was from a woman named Rachel Innes. She said she had read the book. She said she thought her brother might be one of Owen's victims. Her brother's name was Kyle Innes. He had disappeared 16 years ago. He had been working as a night custodian at an office building. He left work at 6 in the morning and never came home. His car was found in the employee lot. His keys were on the driver's seat. His phone was on the dashboard. The police had investigated. They found nothing. Kyle had no enemies, no debts, no reason to disappear. The case went cold. Rachel said she had always believed something had happened to Kyle. She had never believed he left on his own. But she had no proof, no evidence, just a feeling. Then she read the book. She read about Owen's pattern, about how he targeted people who worked alone at night, about how he watched them, about how he took them when they were vulnerable. She said Kyle fit the pattern, and she wanted to know if Grissom could help. Grissom called her. They spoke for an hour. Rachel provided details: Kyle's last known location, his work schedule, his route home, the timeline of his disappearance. Grissom cross-referenced the information with Owen's employment records from 16 years ago. Owen had been working at a janitorial supply company 30 miles from the office building where Kyle worked. The company serviced multiple buildings in the area. Grissom requested the client list. The office building where Kyle worked was on the list. Owen had made deliveries there. Grissom contacted the investigator who had handled Martin Hayes' case. He shared the information about Kyle Innes. He asked if the investigator would be willing to look into it. The investigator agreed. He requested access to the office building. It had been sold and renovated, but the structure was still standing. A search team was sent. Cadaver dogs were brought in. They searched the basement, the utility rooms, the storage areas. The dogs alerted near an old maintenance tunnel that ran beneath the building. The tunnel had been sealed off years ago, deemed unsafe and unnecessary. The search team broke through the seal. They entered the tunnel. It was narrow, dark, filled with debris and stagnant water. 30 feet in, they found a plastic-wrapped bundle wedged into a recessed section of the wall. The remains were transported to the medical examiner. DNA testing was conducted. Positive match: Kyle Innes. Rachel was notified. She broke down on the phone. She said she had waited 16 years. She had never stopped hoping. She had never stopped believing someone would find him. Now she had an answer, and she could bring her brother home. Owen Telly was charged with the murder of Kyle Innes. 16 victims, 16 families with answers. Grissom sat in his office and added Kyle's name to the board. He looked at the timeline. 16 years ago. That was the earliest victim, now confirmed. He wondered if there were others before Kyle. If Owen had started even earlier. If the first victim was still out there, buried somewhere, no one had thought to look. He wondered if he would ever know. Probably not. But that was the nature of the work. You did what you could. You found who you could, and you accepted that some questions would never be answered. Grissom thought about the letter writer again, the anonymous message that had arrived after the first conviction. You found one. There are 4 more. He keeps maps. The letter had been right. There had been more, many more. But the letter writer had never come forward. They had never identified themselves. They remained a ghost, a voice in the margins, a thread that led nowhere. Grissom had stopped trying to find them. He had accepted that some mysteries were meant to stay unsolved. He thought about the unidentified woman, the Jane Doe from the highway expansion. She was still unnamed, still unconnected, still waiting for someone to recognize her. Her facial reconstruction had been shared thousands of times. It had been featured in news stories, true crime podcasts, online forums. People had looked, people had tried, but no one had come forward. She remained Jane Doe. Grissom thought about her every time he looked at the board. He thought about how she had been someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone's co-worker, how she had lived a life, even if no one remembered it now. He thought about how she deserved a name, how she deserved to be mourned, how she deserved to be more than just a case number. But he did not know how to give her that. He had tried. He had done everything he could, and it had not been enough. That was the hardest part. Not the violence, not the loss, but the incompleteness, the gaps that could not be filled, the names that could not be recovered. Grissom stood in his office and felt the weight of it. The years, the cases, the victims, the families, the endless grinding work of searching for truth in places where truth had been buried deep. He thought about Marcus Holloway, the man whose disappearance had started everything, the security guard who had walked into a corridor and never walked out. He thought about the timer, the small digital device that had counted down and unraveled a decade of secrets. He thought about how close it had all come to staying hidden. How, if that one maintenance worker had not found the timer, Marcus might have remained missing, and all the others might have stayed buried. One small object, one moment, one person willing to ask a question. That was all it took to change everything. Grissom thought about the investigators who would come after him, the ones who would open the files and see the gaps, the ones who would look at Jane Doe's reconstruction and wonder, the ones who would keep searching even when the trail was cold and the answers seemed impossible. He hoped they would find what he could not. He hoped they would connect the pieces. He hoped they would give Jane Doe her name back. He hoped they would find the others, the victims who were still missing, the ones Owen had never documented, the ones who had been taken in the early years, before Owen learned to keep records. He hoped someone would keep looking, keep asking questions, keep pulling threads. Because that was the job. Not to finish, not to solve everything, but to keep going, to keep trying, to refuse to let the silence win. Grissom turned off the light in his office. He walked out into the hall. He stood in the doorway and looked back at the board one last time. 16 names, 16 victims identified, 16 families with answers, one Jane Doe, still waiting, and an unknown number still missing, still buried, still silent. He thought about Owen Talley, sitting in his cell, 7 years after Kyle Innes was identified. Grissom received a call from a nursing home administrator. The administrator said they had a resident who had been asking to speak with him. The resident's name was Eleanor Marsh. She was 83 years old. She was in declining health. She said she had information about Owen Talley. Grissom drove to the nursing home the next day. Eleanor was waiting in the common room, seated in a wheelchair near a window. She was frail, thin, her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes were clear. Grissom introduced himself. Eleanor nodded. She said she had been following the case for years. She had read every article. She had watched every news report. And she had kept silent because she was afraid. But now, she said, she was dying. And she could not take the silence with her. Eleanor said that 17 years ago, she had worked as a bookkeeper for a small trucking company. Owen Talley had been employed there briefly as a dispatcher. He had been quiet, unremarkable. She had barely noticed him. But one night, Eleanor had stayed late to finish payroll. She was alone in the office. She heard a noise from the warehouse, a scraping sound, rhythmic, deliberate. She went to investigate. She opened the door to the warehouse floor. She saw Owen standing near a loading bay. He was dragging something heavy, wrapped in a tarp. He was moving slowly, carefully, testing the weight. Eleanor asked what he was doing. Owen stopped. He turned. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said he was moving equipment, checking clearances. Eleanor said she believed him, or she wanted to believe him. She went back to the office. She finished her work. She left. 2 weeks later, a driver from another company reported his truck missing. The truck was found abandoned in a rural area. The driver was never seen again. Eleanor said she never connected the two events, not until years later, when she saw Owen's face on the news, when she learned what he had done. She said she should have said something. She should have called the police. But she had been afraid of being wrong, afraid of causing trouble, afraid of what it would mean. And then the years passed, and it was too late. Grissom asked if Eleanor remembered the driver's name. Eleanor said yes. His name was Dennis York. He was 41 years old. He had a wife and 2 children. Grissom wrote down the name. He thanked Eleanor. He asked if she would be willing to provide a formal statement. Eleanor said yes. She said she was ready. Grissom contacted the investigator who had been handling the recent cases. He shared Eleanor's statement. He shared the name Dennis York. The investigator searched missing person records. Dennis York had been reported missing 17 years ago. The case had been investigated. His truck had been found. No trace of Dennis. The investigator requested Owen's employment records from the trucking company. Owen had worked there for 7 weeks. He had been terminated for unexplained absences and failure to follow protocol. The termination date was 3 days after Dennis York disappeared. The investigator mapped the area where Dennis's truck had been found. It was a rural stretch of land, mostly undeveloped, surrounded by farmland and sparse woods. A search team was assembled. They combed the area. Cadaver dogs were deployed. They searched for 2 days. On the 3rd day, the dogs alerted near a cluster of trees at the edge of a field. The ground was uneven, disturbed long ago, but never properly settled. Excavation began. 6 feet down, they found remains. Male. Estimated age early 40s, wrapped in heavy plastic and secured with rope. DNA testing confirmed the identity. Dennis York. Eleanor Marsh was notified. She wept when she heard. She said she had carried the guilt for 17 years. She said she hoped Dennis's family could find peace now. Dennis's wife was still alive. She was contacted by investigators. She said she had never stopped wondering. She said her children had grown up without their father. She said they had spent 17 years asking why. Now they had an answer. Owen Talley was charged with the murder of Dennis York. 17 victims, 17 names, 17 families with answers. Grissom added Dennis's name to the board. He stood back and looked at the timeline. 17 years ago. That was now the earliest confirmed victim. He wondered if there were others before Dennis. If Owen had started even earlier than that. If the first victim was still out there, still waiting to be found. He wondered if anyone would ever know. Eleanor Marsh passed away 4 months later. Her statement was included in the case file. Her testimony had been recorded. Her courage, late as it was, had brought closure to another family. Grissom attended her funeral. It was small, quiet. A few family members, a few friends. He sat in the back and listened as Eleanor's daughter spoke about her mother, about how she had been kind, about how she had carried regrets, about how, at the end, she had tried to make things right. Grissom thought about that, about how many people carried silence, about how many people saw something, suspected something, but never spoke, because they were afraid, because they did not want to believe, because it was easier to look away. And about how that silence allowed people like Owen to continue, to take more lives, to bury more victims. He thought about Eleanor's courage in coming forward, even at the end of her life, even when she had nothing to gain and everything to lose. He thought about how many others might be out there, carrying similar burdens. People who had seen something, people who knew something, people who were too afraid to speak. He hoped they would find the courage. He hoped they would come forward. He hoped they would help bring closure to the families still waiting. But he knew most of them never would. The silence was too heavy. The fear was too strong. And the years had passed, making it easier to convince themselves that what they saw did not matter, that it was too late, that it would not change anything. But it did matter. It always mattered. Grissom returned home. He sat in his office. He looked at the board. 17 names now. 17 victims pulled from the darkness. And still Jane Doe, the unidentified woman, still waiting. He thought about her often. He thought about how close they had come to identifying her, how many times her reconstruction had been shared, how many tips had come in, only to lead nowhere. He thought about how she would remain nameless unless someone recognized her, unless someone remembered, unless someone came forward. And he thought about how unlikely that was becoming. 17 years had passed since her death. Anyone who knew her might have moved on, might have forgotten, might not even know she was missing. She might have been estranged from her family. She might have been living under a different name. She might have been someone no one was looking for. That was the hardest possibility, that she had been alone, that no one had missed her, that no one had filed a report, that she had disappeared and the world had simply moved on. Grissom stood and walked to the window. He looked out at the rain. It was always raining in his memory. Every crime scene, every search, every moment of standing in the cold and the dark, looking for something buried. He thought about Marcus Holloway, about how it all started, about the timer counting down in that corridor, about the moment the case had broken open and everything hidden had begun to surface. He thought about how one life, one disappearance, had led to the discovery of 16 others. 17 now. He thought about how Marcus's family had gotten answers, about how they had been able to bury him, about how they had been able to grieve. And he thought about Jane Doe, about how she still had no one to bury her, no one to grieve, no one to say her name. He hoped someone would find her name. He hoped the next investigator, or the one after that, would see something he had missed, would make a connection, would bring her home. But he knew it might never happen. Some cases stayed cold. Some names stayed lost. And all you could do was keep the file open, keep the reconstruction circulating, keep hoping that someone, somewhere, would remember. Grissom turned from the window. He walked back to the board. He looked at the names one last time. Marcus Holloway, Eric Lomas, Todd Pritchard, Bryn Coulter, Teresa Wynn, Carl Mundy, Anthony Waite, Daniel Kerr, Martin Hayes, Kyle Innes, Dennis York, and 6 others whose names had been recovered, whose families had been notified, whose stories had been told. 17 lives, 17 families, 17 threads pulled from the darkness, and one Jane Doe, still waiting. Grissom reached out and touched the photograph of her reconstruction, the clay face that someone had built from her skull, the approximation of who she might have been. He whispered, "I am sorry. I am sorry we could not find your name." And then he turned off the light. He walked out of the office. He closed the door behind him. He left the board standing in the darkness, the names waiting, the work unfinished. Because it would always be unfinished. There would always be one more name, one more victim, one more family waiting for answers. But that was the job. That was the burden. That was the responsibility. To keep looking, to keep asking, to keep pulling threads, even when the darkness seemed endless. To refuse to let the silence win. To insist that every name mattered, every life mattered, every victim deserved to be found. Even if it took years, even if it took a lifetime, even if the answers came too late for some. You kept going. You kept trying. You kept believing that somewhere, in the darkness, there was truth waiting to be found. And you never stopped looking. Because someone had to. And that someone was you. Grissom walked out into the rain. He stood on the steps and felt the cold water on his face. He thought about the families, about the victims, about the long, grinding work of searching for truth in places where truth had been buried deep. And he thought about the investigators who would come after him, the ones who would open the files, the ones who would see the gaps, the ones who would keep searching. He thought about them standing where he stood now, looking at the same board, asking the same questions, pulling the same threads. And he hoped they would find what he could not. He hoped they would bring Jane Doe home. He hoped they would close the final case. And he hoped they would understand that the work was never really finished. That justice was not a destination, that it was a process, a commitment, a refusal to give up. That was what he had learned. That was what he would carry with him. The rain fell harder. Grissom turned and walked to his car. He drove home through the dark streets, the case still open, the work still waiting, the names still calling from the shadows. And somewhere, in a cell far away, Owen Telley sat in silence, holding his secrets, believing he had won. But he had not won. He had lost, because the victims had been found, because the families had answers, because the truth had surfaced, no matter how deep it had been buried, and because someone had refused to stop looking. That was victory. Not the conviction, not the sentence, but the refusal to give up, the insistence that every name mattered, the determination to keep pulling threads until there were no more threads to pull. And when there were no more threads, to keep looking anyway. Because that was the job, and it would never be finished.